Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we're stepping back into the humid, perfumed air of 6th century Constantinople, a city humming with the kind of secrets that make modern espionage look like a polite tea party. Picture yourself there, a stranger wandering the cobbled streets. The sun, a heavy orb of gold, beats down on the hippodrome, a massive screaming amphitheatre that isn't just for chariot races, it's the epicentre of the entire empire's seething underbelly. You can feel the vibration of the crowd through the soles of your worn sandals, the smell of sweat and spilled wine on the breeze. It's a city of a million stories, and you're about to hear the one you probably won't survive. The tale of a girl who started at the bottom, the very, very bottom, and clawed her way up to the top of the known world, becoming an empress whose name still whispers through the dusty annals of history with a mix of awe and terror. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening in, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's wild to think about us all scattered across the globe sharing this strange little moment. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a spectator, an invisible ghost floating through this ancient city, and you find yourself drawn to the hippodrome. It's more than just a place of sport. It's the heart of Byzantine social life, where emperors made public appearances and the populace could voice their discontent. The roar is deafening, a tide of human sound that swells and breaks. But your eyes aren't on the speeding chariots. They're on a small, unassuming entrance at the side, a door leading to a world far more captivating and, frankly, far more dangerous. This is where you first encounter her, or at least the rumours of her. Her name is Theodora, and she is an actress. But in this world, that word means something very different than it does to you and me. It means she's a burlesque performer, a courtesan, a woman who lives by her wits and her body on the fringes of acceptable society. It's a mainstream historical fact that Theodora's early life was deeply intertwined with the hippodrome. Her father, Acacius, was a bearkeeper for the Green faction, one of the two major rival chariot teams. The Greens and the Blues were more than just sports clubs. They were political parties with fanatical followers. Imagine if the New York Yankees and the Boston Red Sox were armed political militias that regularly rioted in the streets, and you get a sense of the scale. Theodora and her sisters, Comito and Anastasia, were raised in this gritty, high-stakes environment. They were literally born behind the scenes, accustomed to the chaos, the power struggles, and the rough-and-tumble reality of a world that existed for the pleasure of others. This is where she learned to read people, to understand desire, and to manipulate situations long before she ever sat on a throne. Here's a quirky, almost fantastical detail that really drives home the strangeness of the era. Byzantine medical texts from around this time mention a curious remedy for a variety of ailments involving a poultice made from the powdered remains of a chariot racer's skull. The belief was that the vitality of the athlete would be transferred to the ailing patient. You can almost see the grizzled hippodrome vendors hawking this grisly cure-all. It's a reminder that even amidst the high-level politics and intricate theology, there was a deeply superstitious, almost primal element to Byzantine life. It was a world of magic and brutal pragmatism mixed together, and Theodora navigated both with an uncanny ease. Historians still argue whether Theodora's rise was a matter of sheer, brutal ambition, or a brilliant calculated response to the limited options available to a woman in her station. Was she simply a survivor, a girl doing whatever she had to do to escape the poverty and violence of her birth, or was she a predatory genius from the start? A woman with a vision so grand that she was willing to do anything to achieve it? We can't know for sure, but as you watch the ghostly image of her, a young woman with a sharp gaze and an even sharper wit, you get the sense it was a bit of both. Theodora's life was a masterclass in turning societal contempt into political currency. She understood that if you couldn't be a saint, you could at least become a legend. Her life as an actress was not a sideline gig. It was her entire existence, and it gave her a unique education. She wasn't just performing on a stage, she was performing in a world where her body was her primary tool. We're not talking about a simple theatrical performance. Byzantine burlesque was a raw, often crude affair. Performers like Theodora were known as heterai, a term that blurred the line between entertainer and courtesan. They were expected to be witty, educated, and seductive, entertaining powerful men not just with their physical presence, but with their intellect. This is where Theodora, the future empress, learned the fine art of conversation, the nuances of political gossip and the weaknesses of the powerful men who flocked to see her. She wasn't just a face in the crowd, she was the reason the crowd was there. She was an object of desire, yes, but she was also a student of power, and she was learning her lessons well. The sheer audacity of her trajectory is what makes her so compelling. To go from a bearkeeper's daughter, a public entertainer, to a co-ruler of the Roman Empire, it simply didn't happen. It was a scandal, a perversion of the natural order of things. She had no lineage, no fortune, no traditional education. All she had was an unyielding will, and a deep, intuitive understanding of human nature, particularly its baser side. She understood that power wasn't about who you knew, but about what you were willing to do to get it, and what secrets you were willing to keep. She would leverage her scandalous past, not as a weakness, but as a weapon. Her enemies would try to use it against her, but they would quickly learn that they were underestimating a woman who had already weathered the worst the world could throw at her. The whispers of her past didn't shame her. They solidified her resolve. She was a woman who had nothing to lose and everything to gain, and that made her one of the most dangerous people in the Byzantine world. You're a fly on the wall, floating invisibly from the sweaty, chaotic world of the Hippodrome to the hushed, gilded halls of the Great Palace. The contrast is staggering. One moment, you're in a mob of screaming fans, smelling the dust and the fear of the chariot races. The next, you are surrounded by the sterile, overwhelming opulence of Byzantine imperial power. The air here is heavy with incense and the unspoken weight of 1,000 years of Roman tradition. This is the heart of the empire, a place so sacred that a specific room, the Porphyra or Purple Room, was reserved for the births of emperors and their children. The term, born in the purple, wasn't just a fancy phrase, it was a literal description of a person born in a chamber whose walls were lined with expensive purple porphyry stone. To be porphyrogenitos was to be a member of the most exclusive club on earth, marked by divine destiny from the moment you entered the world. And then you have Theodora, a girl born not in the purple, but in the grime and grease of the circus. A girl who probably had more in common with the bears her father tended than with the delicate empresses who glided through these halls. This is the central, shocking paradox that defines her story. The Byzantine social structure was rigid, a hierarchy as hard and unyielding as the marble floors you now float above. To be a member of the upper echelons required a lineage that stretched back for generations, a name that was synonymous with power and piety. Theodora had none of that. She was an outsider, a commoner who had the audacity not just to enter this world, but to conquer it. Here's a mainstream historical fact that underscores this divide. Theodora's rise was so shocking that the historian Procopius, her most famous and most venomous critic, spent a significant portion of his secret history detailing her scandalous past. He described her as a woman of unspeakable lewdness, painting a vivid, if likely exaggerated, picture of her life as an actress and courtesan. He recounts her stage performances, her relationships with various men, and her complete disregard for social norms. Whether you believe Procopius's account or not, the very existence of such a detailed public denunciation of an empress's past tells you just how radical her ascension was. She was the talk of the town, not just for her power, but for the moral outrage her presence on the throne provoked. Now for a quirky little detail that adds a layer to her persona. One of the theatrical roles she was said to have perfected was that of a lay, a courtesan from ancient Greece famed for her beauty and wit. But Theodora's performance was different. Instead of just portraying the role, she would often perform a pantomime known as the Tale of Leda and the Swan, a very famous Greek myth about the god's debauchery. She would lie on the stage completely naked save for a loose garment, and a slave would sprinkle grains on her groin, and geese would be trained to peck at the grains. It was a bizarre, almost ritualistic performance, one that was both sexually charged and deeply symbolic, and it gave her a kind of scandalous fame that was almost unheard of at the time. This wasn't just about selling a fantasy, it was about commanding an audience, about making a spectacle of herself and owning it. It was a power move, a declaration that she was in control of her own narrative, even when that narrative was designed to titillate. Historians still argue whether Procopius's account of Theodora's life is a truthful record or a politically motivated character assassination. Some scholars believe that his secret history was the product of a disgruntled courtier seeking revenge, while others argue that it contains enough specific details to be at least partially credible. The truth, as is often the case, probably lies somewhere in the middle. Procopius may have embellished the details, but the core fact, that Theodora was a woman of a low birth with a past as an entertainer, was a widely known fact that couldn't be ignored. His history serves as a window into the intense social and political anxieties of the time, revealing just how unsettling Theodora's rise was to the traditional Roman elite. They couldn't believe a woman like her was fit to rule, let alone rule with the authority she did. But here's the thing about Theodora. She understood the power of scandal. She knew that her reputation preceded her, and instead of trying to hide it, she leaned into it. She turned the insults and the gossip into a kind of armour. You probably won't survive this, but you can feel it in the air. She saw her past not as a burden to be shed, but as a source of strength. She had seen the very worst of humanity, and it had made her strong. She was no fragile empress, no delicate flower raised in a sheltered palace. She was a survivor, a street fighter, and she had an understanding of human weakness that no one born in the purple could ever possess. She had to fight for everything she had while they had it all handed to them. This created a profound and ultimately terrifying difference between them. She understood that the men who paid to see her perform were just as trapped by their own desires and weaknesses as she was by her poverty. She knew their secrets, their fears, and their vanities. This was her training ground. The circus wasn't a school for empresses, but it was a school for power. It taught her how to negotiate, how to read people, how to be ruthless when necessary, and how to command attention. Her experience in the back alleys and the burlesque houses gave her an education that was far more valuable than anything she could have learned from a tutor in a gilded palace. It was a brutal education in the real world, and it made her a more effective and more dangerous ruler than anyone who came before her. So, when you consider her in her full glory, seated on a throne in a silk gown, the Empress of the Roman Empire, remember where she came from. Remember the roar of the hippodrome, the smell of the dust, and the scandal that surrounded her every move. This wasn't a fairy tale, it was a hostile takeover. She didn't just marry into power, she seized it, and she did so with a force and a determination that no one saw coming. She was the ultimate disruptor, a living, breathing challenge to the very idea of what a ruler should be. And in the next chapter, we'll see exactly how she used that experience to snag the most eligible bachelor in the Roman Empire. You're still a spectral presence drifting through the Byzantine world, but now you find yourself in the bustling intellectual heart of the empire, the law courts and administrative offices, where a young, ambitious man named Justinian is making his name. He's the nephew of the reigning emperor Justin I, and he's on a trajectory straight to the top. He's sharp, driven, and politically savvy. He's everything Theodora isn't. A product of the system, a man of power and privilege. He's a man who has had everything handed to him on a silver platter, but he's smart enough to know that a platinum-plated platter doesn't guarantee a place in history, and somewhere their paths are about to cross. It's the meeting of two worlds that should, by all accounts, be kept 1,000,000 miles apart. The story goes that Justinian was completely captivated by Theodora. It's easy to imagine why. The court ladies would have been a monotonous lot, all trained in the same polite arts of conversation, all products of the same cloistered education. Theodora, in contrast, would have been a force of nature. She was witty, intelligent, and possessed an experience of the world that none of them could even begin to comprehend. She had a kind of authenticity that was completely foreign to their refined, artificial world. A mainstream historical fact is that Justinian, a man of profound intellectual and political acumen, was so besotted with her that he changed the laws of the empire just so he could marry her. At the time, Roman law strictly forbade a man of senatorial rank from marrying an actress or a woman of similar low social standing. Justinian, seeing no other option, persuaded his uncle, Emperor Justin I, to revoke this law. This act alone shows the sheer depth of his infatuation and his willingness to break with tradition for her. Here's a quirky tidbit that speaks to the bizarre blend of ancient superstition and Christian piety that defined the era. Justinian was known for his extreme asceticism, often fasting and spending long nights in prayer. He was a man obsessed with theology and a relentless worker. One account says he would often go for days without eating or sleeping, surviving on little more than bread and water. To see such a man, a figure of almost saintly devotion and intellectual rigour, fall so completely for a woman with Theodora's background was for many a scandal of biblical proportions. The two were a complete mismatch on paper, the stoic, pious heir and the worldly, scandalous entertainer. Yet, somehow they were a perfect match in reality, a symbiotic unit that would come to define an entire epoch. Historians still argue whether Justinian and Theodora's relationship was a genuine love match or a pragmatic political alliance. Was Justinian's love for her so powerful that it blinded him to her past? Or did he see in her a ruthless political partner, a woman who could do the things he was too pious or too constrained by tradition to do himself? It's a debate that gets to the very heart of their power dynamic. Did he need her as a human being to complete his life, or did he need her as a political asset to cement his reign? Her rise from courtesan to empress suggests that it was a little of both. She was a woman who was unafraid to play the game, and he was a man who needed someone on his side who knew how to play it dirty. Think about it from her perspective. You've clawed your way up from the bottom. You've seen the ugliness of the world, the hypocrisy of the powerful, the casual cruelty of those who have it all. And now, the most powerful man in the empire, the future emperor himself, is at your feet. What do? You don't just accept his offer, you leverage it. Theodora didn't become a passive empress. She became a co-ruler in every sense of the word. She had a political mind as sharp as Justinian's, and a will as strong as iron. She wasn't just his wife. She was his consigliere, his enforcer, and his intellectual equal. She understood the power of an image and the importance of public perception, and she was able to transform herself from the scandalous actress into a figure of imperial majesty. You see this in the mosaics created during their reign. In the Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna, a stunning mosaic depicts Justinian on one side, flanked by bishops and courtiers. On the opposite wall, Theodora stands, equally resplendent, surrounded by her own court of ladies-in-waiting. She's not shown as a subordinate figure. She's a mirror image of her husband, a co-equal ruler of the Roman Empire. This visual representation, a mainstream historical fact, shows how she successfully reshaped her public image, moving from a figure of public shame to a symbol of imperial dignity and power. She didn't hide her past, she transcended it, and in doing so she became something new and unprecedented, a self-made empress. This transformation was not just about clothes and titles, it was about the very nature of power. Theodora, unlike the women who were born in the purple, wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. She had no illusions about the world. She knew that power was a brutal game, and she was willing to play by its rules. She had seen men use women as pawns, and now she was in a position to turn the tables. She would use her understanding of human weakness, her knowledge of the whispers in the dark, and her own brand of ruthless pragmatism to become a political force to be reckoned with. And Justinian, far from being repulsed by this, found it intoxicating. He saw in her a strength he lacked and a willingness to do what was necessary to preserve their power. She wasn't a pawn, she was the queen. And in the next section, we'll see how she used the very things that once shamed her, her past, her body, her understanding of human desire, to build an unshakable fortress of power within the palace walls. You're beginning to see that her history wasn't a handicap, it was her most potent weapon. She had learned the rules of the game in the most brutal of schools, and now she was ready to play for the highest stakes of all. You've made it inside the Great Palace, an invisible guest in a world that operates by a set of rules you could never have imagined. The air is still and heavy, scented with costly perfumes and the faint sweet smell of 1,000 burning candles. Here, behind the high walls and locked doors, the rigid social hierarchy of Byzantine society begins to blur. Power is not just about titles and lineage, it's about access, whispers, and the mastery of a very peculiar kind of political theatre. You can feel a tension in the air, a silent, almost palpable struggle for influence that plays out in hushed conversations and knowing glances. This is Theodora's domain, and you're about to see how her unique past gave her a distinct advantage in this shadowy world. The Byzantine court, for all its public piety and elaborate ritual, was a hotbed of intrigue and often unsettling personal practices. A mainstream historical fact is that the court was a place where rumours were power and alliances were made and broken on a daily basis. The emperor and empress were at the centre of a complex web of courtiers, eunuchs, and advisors, all vying for favour and influence. Theodora, unlike her predecessors, was not a passive figure in this environment. She was a master of it. She understood that the most important deals were not struck in public audience chambers, but in private antechambers, during intimate dinners, or even in the emperor's bedchamber itself. Her past had taught her that personal relationships, particularly intimate ones, were the true currency of power. Here's a quirky tidbit that reveals the bizarre rituals of the Byzantine court. It was a common practice for high-ranking officials to send their young sons to live in the palace as pages, a kind of apprenticeship for future service. But these boys were often subjected to a strange and unsettling form of bonding with the emperor and empress. They were not just trained in courtly manners, they were often used in games and rituals that were designed to test their loyalty and obedience. Some accounts suggest that certain rituals were meant to be symbolic acts of submission, a way for the ruler to assert their absolute authority. It was a kind of psychological warfare, and it was a subtle way for Theodora to assert her dominance over the next generation of powerful men. Historians still argue whether the stories of Theodora's unconventional and ruthless management of the court are exaggerated or if they accurately reflect the reality of a woman who was willing to do anything to consolidate her power. Was she simply a product of her time, a woman who had to be more ruthless than a man to survive, or was she a truly unique and terrifying figure who bent the rules of power to her will? It's a debate that pits the feminist argument against the more traditional historical view of her as a manipulative villain. Her actions were so out of step with the traditional role of an empress that they continue to puzzle and fascinate scholars to this day. You can almost hear the soft rustle of silk and the faint echo of whispers as you drift through the corridors. Theodora is a presence, a force of nature that permeates every corner of this palace. She has a network of spies and informants, many of them women from her past, who have found new lives and new roles within the imperial household. She knows everything. She knows who is sleeping with whom, who is plotting against whom, and who is secretly nursing a grudge against the throne. This isn't just a political strategy, it's a survival mechanism. She had survived the streets by knowing everything, and she would survive the palace by doing the same. She had an almost primal understanding of human weakness, and she was not afraid to exploit it. Remember how her past had given her an education in the baser instincts of men? Now, she uses that knowledge to her advantage. She understands that even the most powerful men are driven by fear, greed, and lust. She knows how to manipulate these desires, how to dangle a promise of power or pleasure in front of a man, and then withdraw it just as he reaches for it. She's a master of the tease, the promise, the reward, and the punishment. She doesn't just manage the court, she dominates it, and she does so with a blend of charm and terror that is uniquely her own. Her rise from the brothel to the throne was a testament to her ability to turn her own body into a political instrument, and she continues to do so, albeit in a different way from her position of power. There are rumours, whispers so low you can barely hear them, of the strange and unorthodox practices that took place within the imperial bedchamber, not of debauchery, but of a kind of intellectual and psychological warfare. It is said that Theodora would often test Justinian's loyalty and resolve, pushing him to his limits, and that their relationship was less about physical passion and more about a complex intellectual and emotional bond. This was a partnership, a union of two equally powerful and equally ruthless individuals who found in each other a kindred spirit. Their marriage was not a surrender, it was a pact, a mutual agreement to conquer the world together, no matter the cost. So, as you float through these hallowed halls, remember that the serene marble and the glimmering gold are a facade. Behind the scenes, the real power is being wielded by a woman who learned everything she knows, not from a textbook, but from the brutal realities of life. She had to, you probably won't survive this, but she had to become something other than human to survive, and in a way, she succeeded. She became a living, breathing symbol of the ruthless pragmatism that defined the Byzantine Empire at its height. And in the next section we'll step back into the hippodrome to see how the chaos of the circus created the mind that would one day rule an empire. The great halls of the palace fade behind you, and you're pulled back into the deafening roar of the hippodrome. The sun is high, a brutal blaze in a cloudless sky, and the air is thick with the scent of dust, sweat, and animal musk. This isn't just a place of entertainment, it's a seething microcosm of Byzantine society. You can feel the tribal loyalty of the factions, the blues and the greens, pulsating through the crowd. Their rivalry wasn't just about winning a race, It was a political, theological and social war played out on the track and in the streets. This is Theodora's home turf, and you can see how the brutality and the spectacle of this world shaped her in ways the Gilded Palace never could. A mainstream historical fact is that these chariot races were a central feature of Byzantine life, and the factions that supported the teams were a powerful political force. The Blues and the Greens were often at odds with the Emperor and with each other, leading to riots and open warfare in the city streets. The famous Nika riots of 532, which nearly toppled Justinian's throne, started as a dispute between these two factions. Theodora, who had grown up in this world, understood its power dynamics in a way that no one else in the court did. She had seen firsthand how quickly a crowd could turn into a mob, how a seemingly trivial dispute could escalate into a full-blown revolution. Here's a quirky tidbit that reveals the bizarre, almost ritualistic aspect of this rivalry. Before a big race, the leaders of the factions would often engage in a kind of ritualized trash talk, using highly theatrical and often poetic insults to taunt their opponents. They would reference ancient myths, obscure theological disputes, and personal scandals to goad each other and the crowd. This was a kind of performance art, a blend of street corner poetry and political slander. Theodora, who had mastered the art of public performance and verbal combat, would have been right at home in this environment. It was here she learned to use words as weapons, to manipulate public opinion, and to control a crowd. Historians still argue whether the factionalism of the Hippodrome was a genuine expression of public opinion, or a tool used by the elite to manipulate the masses. Was it a grassroots movement, a genuine reflection of the people's will, or was it a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to keep the populace distracted and divided? The truth is likely somewhere in between. The factions were a real and powerful force, but they were also susceptible to manipulation from the court and from the wealthy patrons who funded them. Theodora, having a foot in both worlds, understood how to leverage these dynamics to her advantage. As you look out over the screaming crowd, you can see the ghostly image of Theodora as a young girl, watching from the sidelines. She's observing, learning. She sees how the faction leaders wield power, how they use charisma and fear to command loyalty. She sees the brutal consequences of failure, the bodies of defeated racers and their horses dragged from the track. This was her school. This was where she learned that life was a zero-sum game, that in order to win, someone else had to lose. She learned that sentimentality was a weakness, and that ruthlessness was a virtue. She learned that the world wasn't a fair place, and that the only way to survive was to be tougher and smarter than everyone else. Her family was part of the Green faction, and this alliance would have a lasting impact on her life. The factions weren't just about a team, they were about a political identity, and that identity came with its own set of rules and rivalries. Theodora would have known the leaders of the Greens, the wealthy patrons who funded them, and the common people who followed them with a fanatical devotion. This network, this understanding of the street-level politics of Constantinople, would become an invaluable tool when she became empress. She knew how to speak to the people, how to play on their fears and their hopes, and how to command their loyalty in a way that no one born in the purple ever could. You can imagine her in the shadows, listening to the gossip of the Green faction, the whispers of who was betraying whom, who was secretly in debt, and who was sleeping with the wrong person. This was the real education of an empress, not in a library of dusty tomes, but in the brutal, visceral reality of the city streets. She learned that power was not about divine right. It was about knowing the right secrets and having the courage to use them. She learned that reputation was everything, and that if you were going to be reviled anyway, you might as well make it count. She was a master of the back alley and the whispered rumour, a skill set that would prove far more valuable in the palace than any book learning. The Hippodrome also taught her about spectacle and performance. She had seen how the crowds were manipulated by the sight of a dramatic victory or a brutal defeat. She learned how to use drama and emotion to command attention. This was the same skill she would later use to command an entire empire. She would use public appearances and carefully orchestrated political moves to control her image, and to project an aura of power that was both seductive and terrifying. She would turn the art of performance, the very thing that once shamed her, into the engine of her reign. She was no longer performing for a crowd. The entire world was her stage, and the emperor himself was her co-star. The crowd roars, a living, breathing creature of sound and fury. But you're not in the stands anymore. You've been pulled behind the curtain, into the dusty, cramped spaces where the performers prepared for their shows. The air is thick with the scent of cheap perfume, body paint, and the faint, sweet smell of 1,000 fading roses. This is the stage where Theodora, the future empress, learned the most important lessons of her life. She learned how to use her body not as a passive object of desire, but as a political and social instrument. Her transition from a performer to a power broker was a masterclass in leveraging one's assets in a hostile and unforgiving world. A mainstream historical fact is that Theodora's rise from the stage to the court was unprecedented. No woman of her social standing had ever achieved such a position. The ancient Roman and Byzantine empires had a very clear social hierarchy, and an actress was at the very bottom of it. They were often equated with prostitutes and were subject to a series of laws that stripped them of many basic rights. They could not marry citizens of high rank, they were excluded from polite society, and their testimony in court was considered unreliable. Theodora, however, didn't just break these rules, she obliterated them. She used her position to gain access to powerful men, not just as a source of income, but as a source of information and influence. She learned their weaknesses, their desires, and their secrets. She turned the very thing that was meant to disempower her into her most potent weapon. Here's a quirky tidbit that adds a layer of the theatrical to her story. It was rumoured that she had a talent for mimicry and a genius for impersonation. She could perfectly imitate the mannerisms and speech patterns of the powerful men she met, often using these skills to mock them in private, or to gain a deeper understanding of their personalities. She was, in essence, a spy, using her performance skills to gather intelligence and to understand the inner workings of the Byzantine elite. She learned to read faces, to hear the subtext of a conversation, and to see the vulnerabilities that lay beneath the most formidable exteriors. She was an actress, yes, but she was acting for her life and for power. Historians still argue whether Theodora's rise was a reflection of Justinian's unique character, or if it signalled a deeper shift in Byzantine society's attitudes towards women and social mobility. Was Justinian's fascination with her a one-off anomaly, or was it a sign that the rigid class structure was beginning to crack? Theodora's story is a fascinating case study in how a single powerful individual can bend the rules of an entire society, and scholars continue to debate the broader implications of her reign. Was she a harbinger of a new era, or just a powerful, charismatic anomaly that could never be replicated? As you watch her ghostly form glide through the smoky backstage area, you can see her in 1,000 different roles. The flirtatious courtesan, the witty intellectual, the calculating observer, the ruthless manipulator. She was all of these things, and she could switch between them with an effortless grace that was a testament to her skills as an actress and a survivor. You can almost feel her presence, the aura of a woman who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. She had no illusions about the world. She knew that men would use her if they could, so she decided to use them first. She understood that power wasn't a gift. It was something that had to be seized and held with an iron grip. Her experiences taught her a fundamental truth about human nature, that everyone, no matter how powerful, has a price. For some, it's money. For others, it's fame. For many, it's sex. And for the most powerful, it's the promise of more power. Theodora was a master of identifying a man's weakness and using it to her advantage. She had seen the lust and the greed in the eyes of the men who came to see her perform, and she knew how to use that to get what she wanted. She wasn't just selling a fantasy, she was gathering information, building a network and laying the groundwork for her future. The journey from the brothel to the throne was a long and arduous one, but Theodora made it by treating every encounter, every performance, every relationship as a step on the ladder. She was a woman who was constantly evaluating her own position, constantly looking for an opportunity to advance. She was, in a way, the ultimate capitalist. She understood that her greatest asset was herself, and she was going to use it to its full potential. She was a living, breathing testament to the idea that in a world of rigid social rules, you could break them all if you were smart enough and ruthless enough. And when she met Justinian, she wasn't just meeting a powerful man, she was meeting a man who could give her everything she had ever dreamed of. She saw in him not just a husband, but a political partner, a co-conspirator in a grand plan to conquer the world. She didn't just seduce him with her body, she seduced him with her mind. She appealed to his ambition, his intellect, and his desire to build a legacy. She showed him that she was more than just a beautiful woman. She was a brilliant strategist, a loyal ally, and a formidable partner. And in a world where empresses were often passive figureheads, she promised to be an active and very powerful co-ruler. This was a new kind of power, a new kind of relationship. Theodora wasn't just a wife, she was a partner. She wasn't just a consort, she was a co-emperor. She had turned the flesh that once defined her into the foundation of an empire, and in doing so she had created a new kind of power dynamic, one that would terrify and fascinate the world for centuries to come. You're now a silent witness inside the heart of the Great Palace, specifically within the Imperial Bedchamber, a space that was both a sanctuary and a strategic command centre. The air here is no longer heavy with the sounds of the Hippodrome. It's hushed, thick with a mix of costly frankincense and the unspoken weight of empire. This is where Theodora and Justinian's relationship truly took form, a union that was far more than a simple marriage. It was a fusion of two powerful and profoundly different personalities, a partnership that would reshape the Byzantine world. A mainstream historical fact is that Justinian and Theodora's marriage was not a typical dynastic union. It was a relationship based on a deep intellectual and emotional bond, a connection that transcended the normal roles of husband and wife in that era. While many emperors took their wives for political alliances, Justinian married Theodora for a love so profound that he was willing to defy social conventions and change the law of the land. But their love was not a soft romantic affair. It was a partnership of equals in the most ruthless sense of the word. They ruled together, with Theodora often holding as much, if not more, power than her husband. Here's a quirky tidbit about their relationship that speaks to its unconventional nature. Justinian, a man known for his rigid piety and ascetic habits, was said to be completely subservient to Theodora in all matters of the heart and mind. The historian Procopius, for all his venom, notes that Justinian could do nothing without Theodora, and that she held a kind of psychological sway over him that was both absolute and unbreakable. He was a man of the mind, a jurist, and a theologian, and she was a woman of action, a pragmatist and a survivor. Their relationship was a strange and potent blend of intellect and instinct, and it gave them a kind of power that was unmatched in the ancient world. Historians still argue whether Theodora and Justinian's relationship was a true love match or a calculated political partnership, or perhaps a complex combination of both. Was Justinian's love for her so profound that it gave her unparalleled power, or did he recognise her unique ruthlessness as a necessary asset for his reign? The debate centres on whether Theodora's influence was a result of her charisma and intelligence, or if it was a carefully orchestrated political strategy on her part to gain control of the empire. The answer, as you can probably guess, is a little of both. They were two halves of a whole, each providing what the other lacked, and together they formed an unstoppable political machine. The imperial bedchamber, you realise, wasn't just for sleeping. It was a place of high-stakes diplomacy, where Theodora would receive ambassadors, confer with generals, and make decisions that affected the lives of millions. She had her own court, her own network of spies and informants, and her own agenda. She was not a passive figurehead. She was an active participant in the governance of the empire. She was the one who often had the last word, the final say, the ultimate judgment. She was the queen, and Justinian was the king, and together they were the ultimate power couple. You can almost feel her presence, the aura of a woman who was in complete control. She knew how to use her unique position to her advantage. She had access to Justinian at all times, and she used that access to shape his decisions and to promote her own agenda. She was his confidant, his advisor, his lover, and his co-conspirator. Their relationship was a living, breathing testament to the idea that true power is not about titles or lineage. It is about influence and control. And Theodora, with her background as an actress and a courtesan, was a master of both. Her past as a performer gave her a unique understanding of human nature. She knew that even the most powerful men were susceptible to flattery, to manipulation, to the promise of pleasure or power. She used this knowledge to great effect within the palace walls. She was a master of the double game, of saying one thing and doing another, of making a man feel important while she was secretly undermining him. She was, in a way, a political genius, and her stage was the imperial court. This was a partnership built on a foundation of mutual trust and respect, but it was also a partnership of equals, who were both willing to do whatever was necessary to maintain their power. Theodora was not afraid to make hard choices, to order executions, to engage in acts of political vengeance. She was a pragmatist who understood that sometimes you had to be cruel to be kind. Justinian, a man of profound intellectual and philosophical depth, needed someone by his side who was willing to get their hands dirty. And Theodora, with her background in the brutal realities of the street, was more than willing to do so. The imperial bedchamber, you realise, was where the real business of empire was conducted. The public forums, the official decrees, the grand speeches, all of that was just for show. The real decisions were made here, in the quiet intimacy of the night, between a man who had everything and a woman who had to fight for every single thing she had. Their relationship was a living, breathing paradox, a union of a pious emperor and a scandalous empress, a partnership of love and ruthlessness, a testament to the idea that true power is often found in the most unlikely of places. She had turned the intimate, personal space of the bedchamber into a command centre for the entire Roman Empire, and in doing so she had created a new kind of power dynamic, one that would terrify and fascinate the world for centuries to come. The polished marble floor of the great palace feels cool beneath your feet as you drift, a silent observer into the most peculiar and powerful of its inner circles. You find yourself in the company of eunuchs, men who, having been castrated, were rendered physically incomplete, yet were paradoxically elevated to positions of immense power and trust within the Byzantine court. This was Theodora's special sphere of influence. These were her eyes and ears, her secret police, and her most trusted advisors. Their unique position, outside the traditional male power structures of marriage and lineage, made them loyal not to a family name, but to the person who gave them power. For Theodora, this meant unwavering loyalty. A mainstream historical fact is that eunuchs played a crucial and pervasive role in the Byzantine Empire, holding key administrative, military and even religious positions. They were seen as ideal servants for the imperial family because they could not create a dynastic challenge. Their inability to have children meant they couldn't found a powerful family to rival the emperor, making them a safe and reliable choice for positions of immense responsibility. They managed the imperial finances, commanded armies, and acted as private secretaries and personal confidants to the emperor and empress. Theodora, in particular, recognised their unique utility and cultivated a network of loyal eunuchs who served her personally. Here's a quirky tidbit that reveals the bizarre social status of eunuchs. While they were often seen as physically less than, they were also paradoxically revered for their incorruptibility and their ability to live lives free of worldly temptation. They were considered blessed by some, with a special spiritual status that placed them somewhere between the worldly and the divine. They could enter parts of the palace and imperial quarters that other men were forbidden from entering, giving them unparalleled access to the private lives of the emperor and empress. This made them perfect for Theodora's brand of back-channel politics. Historians still argue whether Theodora's reliance on eunuchs was a sign of her own insecurity and a need for absolute loyalty, or if it was a brilliant and pragmatic political strategy. Was she simply a woman who trusted only those who could not pose a physical or dynastic threat, or did she see in them a ready-made power base that was completely outside the traditional, patriarchal structures of the court? It's a debate that gets to the very heart of her character. Was she a paranoid tyrant or a visionary strategist? The truth is likely a blend of both, but her use of the eunuchs was a masterstroke of political cunning. You can almost feel the hushed atmosphere of this inner sanctum. The eunuchs move with a quiet efficiency, their faces often impassive, their minds working behind the scenes. They were Theodora's conduits to the city, her ears to the street. She had them placed in every part of the government, in every wealthy household and in every corner of the empire. They brought her information, they carried out her commands, and they served as her personal bodyguards and enforcers. They were a secret police force that was loyal to her alone, a shadow government that operated outside the normal lines of power. She had learned from her time on the streets that information was power, and the eunuchs were her source of an endless supply of it. This reliance on a loyal, personal network was a stark contrast to Justinian's style of rule, which was more formal and focused on public institutions. While Justinian was busy with his massive legal reforms and his ambitious building projects, Theodora was busy shoring up their power from the inside out. She was building a political machine that was completely beholden to her will, and the eunuchs, with their unique position and their deep-seated loyalty, were the cogs in that machine, They were the ones who carried out her ruthless purges, who silenced her enemies, and who ensured that her will was done no matter the cost. Remember her past. Remember how she had to rely on herself and her own wits to survive. That same sense of self-reliance and deep-seated suspicion was what drove her to create this network. She couldn't trust the old families, the men who had once looked down on her, the women who whispered about her past. She had to create her own power base, a new kind of loyalty that was forged not in the blood of a shared lineage, but in the gratitude of a shared dependence. She was their patron, their protector, and their source of power. In return, they gave her a kind of loyalty that no emperor could ever buy. Theodora's relationship with her eunuchs also gave her an unparalleled control over the imperial harem and the private lives of the court. The eunuchs managed the affairs of the women in the palace, and in doing so, they gave Theodora an intimate knowledge of their secrets and their vulnerabilities. She knew which women were ambitious, which were disloyal, and which were easily manipulated. This knowledge was a form of power, a tool she would use to control and dominate her rivals. She had created a world where the only path to success was through her, and where the most dangerous person to cross was not the emperor, but his empress. The alliance between Theodora and her eunuchs was a perfect storm of political cunning and social engineering. She gave them the power and respect they had been denied by a society that saw them as incomplete. In return, they gave her a kind of loyalty and a kind of control that was unprecedented. She was not just their empress, she was their champion, and together they would rule the empire with a blend of efficiency, ruthlessness, and absolute power that was as terrifying as it was effective. It was a new kind of power dynamic, one that was forged in the shadows of the palace, and one that would cement her legacy as one of the most feared and respected rulers in Byzantine history. The quiet hum of the palace is now punctuated by the soft, unsettling sound of whispers. 1,000 secrets passed from person to person, a network of information that is Theodora's most potent weapon. You're a ghost floating through the shadows, and you can feel the palpable fear in the air, a tension that comes not from a visible enemy, but from an invisible force that seems to know everything. This force, you realize, is Theodora's network of informants, and her most powerful tool is sexual blackmail. She understood, with a terrifying clarity, that the most powerful men were often the most vulnerable, and that their secret desires and indiscretions were a lever she could use to control them completely. A mainstream historical fact is that Theodora's reputation for using intimidation and manipulation to get what she wanted was widely known. The historian Procopius, in his Secret History, dedicates a significant portion of his text to detailing the cruel and unusual methods she used to consolidate her power. While his account is often seen as exaggerated, the very existence of these stories suggests that her methods were far from conventional. She was a master of the double game, of making a man feel secure while she was secretly gathering evidence against him. Her past as a courtesan had given her an intimate knowledge of the sexual appetites of the elite, and she used this knowledge to her advantage. She knew their fetishes, their secret rendezvous, and the identities of their mistresses, and she wasn't afraid to use this information to ruin them. Here's a quirky tidbit that reveals the bizarre extent of her power. Theodora was rumoured to have had a network of informers, many of them women from her past life as a performer, who were still working in the city's theatres and brothels. These women would report back to her, detailing the indiscretions of the wealthy and powerful men who frequented these establishments. She was, in essence, a spy master, and her spies were the very people who were meant to be at the bottom of the social ladder. This gave her a constant supply of fresh intelligence, a steady stream of secrets that she could use to bend powerful men to her will. Historians still argue whether Theodora's use of sexual blackmail was a political necessity for a woman in her position, or a sign of a truly malevolent personality. Was she simply using the tools available to her to survive in a hostile patriarchal world, or was she a sadist who took pleasure in the destruction of others? The debate is a fascinating one, and it gets to the very heart of the nature of power. Does power corrupt, or does it simply reveal who you are? In Theodora's case, it seems to have done a little of both. She was a woman who had been used and abused, and now she was in a position to turn the tables. She was using the very things that had once shamed her to destroy the men who had once looked down on her. You can almost feel the fear in the air as you float through the palace. A high-ranking senator, a man who once publicly denounced Theodora's marriage to Justinian, is suddenly found to be embroiled in a scandalous affair with a low-born woman. He is forced to resign his post and retire to the countryside, his reputation in ruins. A general, a man who dared to question Theodora's military strategy, is found to be secretly consorting with the Empire's enemies. He is arrested, tried, and executed. The pattern is clear. If you crossed Theodora, your deepest secrets would be exposed, your life would be ruined, and you would be made an example of. This wasn't just about political power, it was about psychological control. Theodora wasn't just eliminating her enemies, she was humiliating them. She was showing them that she knew their deepest, darkest secrets, and that she wasn't afraid to use them. She was a master of the game, a woman who understood that the true source of power was not in physical strength or military might, but in the knowledge of another person's weaknesses. She had learned this lesson the hard way, and now she was teaching it to the entire empire. Her use of sexual blackmail was a perfect storm of her past and her present. She had seen the lust and the hypocrisy of the powerful men who came to the theatre, and now she was using that knowledge to expose them. She had learned to read people's desires, to see the things they tried to hide, and she was using that skill to build her own personal empire of fear. She was a woman who had been judged for her past, and now she was the one who was doing the judging. The Byzantine court was a world of public piety and private debauchery, and Theodora was the one who held the key to both. She understood that men would pretend to be pious in public, while secretly indulging in all manner of sins in private. And she was more than happy to expose their hypocrisy. She was not a moralist, she was a pragmatist. She didn't care about their sins, she cared about their power. And she was more than happy to trade their secrets for their loyalty. This was a new kind of power dynamic, one that was completely out of step with the traditional patriarchal structures of the court. Theodora wasn't just a political ruler, she was a psychological one. She had an unshakable grip on the minds of the men around her, and she used that grip to maintain her power and to secure her legacy. She was a woman who had been shamed for her past, and now she was using that past to shame an entire empire into submission. And you, as a silent witness, can feel the fear that she instilled in the heart of every man who dared to cross her. You're a phantom gliding through the hushed and heavily perfumed chambers of the great palace's most secluded wing, the imperial harem. This isn't the romanticized, veiled world of later centuries. It's a cold, political space, a gilded cage where women of high birth and low fortune alike were held, their lives a constant performance of loyalty and rivalry. Here, in the quiet cruelty of the inner court, Theodora's rise was not a cause for celebration, but for silent, seething fear. The Empress, having emerged from a past that defied all norms, now stood as the ultimate arbiter of power within these very walls. Her history had given her a terrifying understanding of how to dominate, and the harem became her personal chessboard. A mainstream historical fact about this period is that the imperial harem was a crucial political institution, not merely a place for the emperor's pleasure. The women within it, from the empress herself down to the lowest chambermaids, were instruments of diplomacy and political manoeuvring. The daughters of foreign rulers and powerful Byzantine families were often brought into the harem to cement alliances. Their every move, every interaction, was scrutinized for signs of favour or disfavour, and their alliances with powerful eunuchs or court officials could mean the difference between a life of luxury and a sudden, quiet death. Theodora, however, didn't just play this game, she rewrote its rules. Here's a quirky tidbit that underscores the strange power dynamics at play. The Byzantine court was obsessed with ritual and symbolism. One of the most telling of these was the ritual of the slipper, where the empress would anoint a new courtier by placing a slipper on their head. This seemingly innocuous act was a public display of submission and a clear sign of the empress's absolute authority over the court. Theodora was said to have used this ritual with a particularly menacing flair, turning a traditional act into a subtle, terrifying reminder of her power. She would often perform it on men who had once looked down on her, the gesture a silent act of triumphant revenge. Historians still argue whether Theodora's domination of the harem was a genuine political necessity, or an expression of a deep-seated personal vendetta against the women of the upper class who had once ostracized her. Was she simply consolidating power in the way any shrewd ruler would, or was she taking personal pleasure in the humiliation and destruction of those who represented the very class she was once excluded from? The debate reveals the dual nature of her character, a brilliant strategist and a deeply vengeful woman. Her actions within the harem were a perfect blend of both, a cold, calculated move to eliminate rivals wrapped in the guise of administrative necessity. You can sense the tension in the air as you float through the private quarters. The women move with a practiced grace, their faces betraying nothing, but in their eyes you see a flicker of 1,000 different emotions. Fear, ambition, jealousy. Theodora is a shadow that looms over their lives. She knows their secrets, their alliances, and their weaknesses. She had a network of informers, many of them eunuchs and even other women, who would report to her on every conversation, every letter, every whispered secret. A seemingly innocent exchange could lead to exile or worse. The harem was not a sanctuary, it was a prison, and Theodora was its warden. The women in the harem had a kind of soft power. They could influence the emperor, manipulate their husbands, and forge powerful alliances. But Theodora had hard power, a ruthlessness born from a life lived outside these cushioned walls. She wasn't afraid to use it. She had a keen eye for ambition, and a zero-tolerance policy for disloyalty. She had seen what happens when women are used as pawns, and she was determined that she and her allies would be the players, not the pieces. She could, and did, order the arrest and exile of women who posed even the slightest threat to her rule, sending them to remote monasteries or exiling them to far-flung islands, their fates decided with a single, unfeeling command. This was a new kind of power, a power that wasn't just political, but deeply personal. Theodora's reign was a living, breathing testament to the idea that the personal is political. Her personal history of being marginalized and underestimated gave her the motivation to dominate the very women who represented everything she was not. Born in the purple, high-bred, and seemingly pure, she saw their innocence not as a virtue, but as a weakness. They were unprepared for her brand of brutal street-level politics, and they were no match for her. The perils of the harem were not just about betrayal and intrigue. They were about the very nature of existence under Theodora's rule. You could be a high-ranking noblewoman, a favourite of the emperor, but if you crossed the empress, your life was over. She'd created a world where the only path to survival was through absolute and unwavering loyalty to her. She had turned the traditional female power structure on its head, replacing the delicate dance of influence with the brutal efficiency of a military campaign. The harem, under Theodora's rule, was a living lesson in the art of intimidation. The women who lived there learned that their beauty, their lineage and their charm meant nothing if they did not have the empress's favour. She had a kind of psychological dominance over them that was born of her own past, a past where she had to fight for every scrap of respect and every bit of power. And now she was in a position to demand that respect, and she would not hesitate to destroy anyone who dared to question her authority. She was the empress, and she was the warden of the most dangerous prison in the world. You're a silent witness to a cold, calculated campaign of terror. The palace no longer feels like a place of ceremony and tradition. It feels like a hunting ground. Theodora, the empress, is not just a ruler. She is a predator, and her prey are the people who once scorned her. You can sense her focus, her single-minded determination to settle old scores, and her willingness to use the full power of the empire to do so. This isn't just about consolidating power, it's about a deep-seated personal vendetta. Theodora's revenge, you realise, is a dish best served cold, and she has been waiting for centuries to serve it. A mainstream historical fact is that Theodora's rise was accompanied by the systematic ruin of many of the powerful Roman families who had once looked down on her. The historian Procopius, in his Secret History, recounts in chilling detail the ways in which she would destroy her enemies. He tells of men who were accused of fabricated crimes, of women who were exiled to remote monasteries, and of families who were stripped of their wealth and their status. This wasn't just a political purge, it was a personal one, a ruthless settling of accounts that was driven by Theodora's past traumas and her unyielding desire to see her enemies suffer. Her revenge was not a fleeting act of anger. It was a carefully planned, long-term strategy of psychological and political destruction. Here's a quirky tidbit that adds a layer of theatricality to her cruelty. It was rumoured that Theodora would often have her enemies brought to her, not to be publicly humiliated, but to be privately taunted. She would have them wait for hours, sometimes days, in an antechamber, their fate hanging in the balance, before she would finally grant them an audience. When they were finally brought before her, She would not shout or scream. She would simply remind them of their past insults, their public denunciations of her, and the ways in which they had once looked down on her. The psychological torment of this process was often more devastating than any physical punishment. It was a kind of theatrical revenge, a performance designed to show them that she was not just their ruler, but their master. Historians still argue whether Theodora's viciousness was a product of her own personal pain, or a necessary evil in the cutthroat world of Byzantine politics. Was her revenge a cathartic act of personal justice, or was it a pragmatic move to eliminate any potential rivals to the throne? The debate highlights the complex nature of her character. She was a woman who had been deeply hurt, and she was now in a position to inflict that same pain on others. But she was also a woman who understood that a show of force was sometimes necessary to maintain power. Her revenge was a perfect blend of both, a personal act of vengeance that had a very real political purpose. You can almost feel the fear in the air as you float through the palace. A high-ranking official, a man who once dismissed Theodora as a common harlot, is now grovelling at her feet, begging for his life. She looks at him with a cold, unfeeling gaze, her eyes a window into a world of pain and suffering. She doesn't see a man, she sees a symbol of all the people who had ever hurt her, and she's more than happy to make an example of him. She orders his arrest, his wealth is confiscated, and his family is scattered to the winds. The message is clear. The past is not forgotten, and the Empress does not forgive. This was a new kind of power, a kind of psychological dominance that was completely out of step with the traditional patriarchal structures of the court. Theodora wasn't just a political ruler, she was a psychological one. She had an unshakable grip on the minds of the men and women around her, and she used that grip to maintain her power and to secure her legacy. She was a woman who had been shamed for her past, and now she was using that past to shame an entire empire into submission. She had turned her own pain into a weapon, and she was wielding it with a terrifying precision. Her revenge was not just about destroying her enemies, it was about remaking the world in her own image. She was tearing down the old social order, the one that had excluded her and her kind, and she was building a new one in its place. She was showing the world that lineage and tradition meant nothing, and that power, true power, was in the hands of those who were willing to do whatever was necessary to get it. She was a living, breathing testament to the idea that you could rise from the ashes of your past and become a force of nature. Theodora's viciousness was a product of her own life, a life of being marginalized, of being judged, of being used. She had seen the worst of humanity, and she was now giving it back to them, tenfold. She was a woman who had been forced to be tough, and now she was using that toughness to dominate an entire empire. Her revenge was not just an act of cruelty, it was an act of survival, a testament to her unyielding will and her indomitable spirit. And in the end, her revenge was successful. The old families were gone, their power and their wealth absorbed into the imperial coffers. The new order was in place, and Theodora was at its head. She had proven to the world that she was not just a harlot who had stumbled into power. She was a ruthless, brilliant, and terrifying empress who had earned her place on the throne. And you, as a silent witness, can feel the fear that she instilled in the heart of every man and woman who dared to cross her. The hushed piety of the great palace's private chapel feels like a stark contrast to the brutal political manoeuvring you've just witnessed. The air is thick with the scent of burning incense and beeswax, and the soft light of 1,000 candles flickers on the golden mosaics of saints and martyrs. You watch as Theodora, a woman who had used every conceivable tool of sin to rise to power, kneels in solemn prayer. Her head is bowed, her hands clasped, and her face is a mask of serene devotion. This is the great paradox of her reign. The woman who was a master of political debauchery was also a fervent champion of Orthodox Christianity. Theodora, the harlot empress, was also in her own mind a saint. A mainstream historical fact that showcases this paradox is Theodora's deep and genuine interest in theology. She was a devout monophysite, a Christian sect that held that Christ had a single, unified nature, as opposed to the Chalcedonian belief that he had two distinct natures, divine and human. This was a major theological debate of the time, and Theodora used her influence to protect monophysite clergy and promote her theological views, often at odds with her husband Justinian's more orthodox position. She was a patron of monasteries and a protector of the poor, and she founded a famous convent. the Convent of Repentance for former prostitutes, a poignant gesture that speaks to her own past. Here's a quirky tidbit that adds to the bizarre blend of piety and pragmatism. Theodora was known to have a peculiar obsession with relics. She would often pay enormous sums of money to acquire the bones of saints or pieces of the true cross, believing that these holy objects would not only protect her, but would also lend a divine legitimacy to her reign. She had a personal collection of these relics, and she would often pray over them, seeking their guidance and their blessings. It was a bizarre blend of superstition and faith, a belief that the physical artifacts of a holy life could confer power and protection on a woman who had lived a life of sin. Historians still argue whether Theodora's piety was a genuine expression of faith or a calculated political move to legitimize her rule. Was she a true believer? A woman who, having seen the worst of humanity, found solace in the divine? Or was she a shrewd politician who understood the power of religion to sway the masses? The debate reveals the complex and often contradictory nature of her character. She was a woman who was capable of both profound cruelty and profound compassion, a pragmatist who was also a true believer. Her piety, whether genuine or feigned, was a crucial part of her political identity, and she used it to cement her power and to remake her public image. You can almost feel the air in the chapel, the heavy silence, the weight of 1,000 years of faith. Theodora is a picture of serene devotion, but you, as a silent witness, know the secrets that lie beneath the surface. You know that this woman, who is now kneeling in prayer, is the same woman who ordered the deaths of her enemies, who used sexual blackmail to control powerful men, and who dominated the court with a terrifying ruthlessness. The contrast is jarring, and it is a testament to her genius. She was a woman who understood that in order to rule an empire, you had to be a master of both the sacred and the profane. She had to be a saint in public and a devil in private, and she was more than capable of playing both roles. Her public piety was a crucial part of her public relations campaign. She was a woman who was constantly under attack for her past, and her faith was her shield. She showed the world that she was not just a harlot who had stumbled into power, but a righteous ruler who was guided by God. She used her piety to silence her critics, to win the support of the church, and to create an image of herself as a just and compassionate ruler. It was a brilliant move, a masterstroke of political theatre, and it worked. The people, who had once reviled her, now saw her as a divine instrument, a woman who had been chosen by God to lead them. But her piety was also a source of her power. She had a deep and abiding belief in her own destiny, a conviction that she had been chosen by God to rule. This belief gave her a kind of unshakable confidence, a sense of purpose that made her even more terrifying. She wasn't just a political opportunist. She was a woman on a divine mission, and she would stop at nothing to fulfill it. Her faith was not a weakness. It was a source of her strength, and she used it to justify her most brutal acts. She believed that she was doing God's will, and that belief made her capable of anything. Theodora's journey from the brothel to the throne was a testament to her ability to turn her own sin into a source of sanctified power. She had used the profane to achieve her goals, and now she was using the sacred to justify them. She was a living, breathing paradox, a woman who embodied the very tension between good and evil. And you, as a silent witness, can feel the power that she wielded, a power that was born of a blend of ruthless pragmatism and a deep, abiding faith. She was a woman who had made a pact with the devil and a pact with God, and she was more than happy to rule in both of their names. You're a silent, unseen presence drifting through the bustling streets and whispered corners of Constantinople. The air is alive with rumour, 1,000 voices carrying tales of the empress who was once a prostitute. You can feel the weight of these whispers, a constant low-level hum that is both a source of fear and a source of power. Theodora, the empress, is not a figure of serene majesty in the popular imagination. She is a myth, a legend, a serpent who has slithered her way to the throne. Her past, once a source of shame, has now become a weapon in the hands of her enemies and a source of her legend for those who fear and admire her in equal measure. A mainstream historical fact is that the Byzantine world, despite its rigid class structure, was a deeply superstitious and rumour-driven society. The powerful were not just judged by their actions, but by their reputations, and the rumour mill was a crucial part of the political landscape. Theodora's reputation in particular was the subject of endless gossip. Tales of her scandalous past were whispered in the market squares, in the bathhouses, and in the private homes of the elite. These rumours, whether true or false, served a very real political purpose. They were a way for her enemies to undermine her legitimacy and to sow discord within the empire. They were a constant reminder that she was not born in the purple, and that her reign was a perversion of the natural order. Here's a quirky tidbit that reveals the bizarre, almost folkloric quality of these rumours. It was said that Theodora had a familiar, a kind of magical animal or spirit, that would whisper secrets to her in the dead of night. This creature, a serpent or a raven, was said to be the source of her uncanny political instincts and her ability to know the secrets of her enemies. These were not just idle tales. They were a way for the populace to explain her unprecedented rise to power. They couldn't believe that a woman of her background could achieve such a position through conventional means, so they attributed her success to a kind of dark magic. Historians still argue whether the rumours of Theodora's scandalous past and her ruthless methods were a reflection of a deep-seated truth or a carefully crafted political smear campaign by her enemies. Was Procopius's secret history a truthful account, or was it a piece of slander designed to destroy her legacy? The debate highlights the difficulty of separating fact from fiction in a world where rumour was often as powerful as reality. The truth is likely a combination of both. Theodora's past was indeed unconventional, and her enemies used it to their advantage, embellishing the truth to make her seem more monstrous than she was. But the fact that these rumours resonated so deeply with the public is a testament to the powerful hold her story had on the popular imagination. You can almost feel the whispers in the air, 1,000 voices telling 1,000 different versions of the same story. A merchant whispers about a time when Theodora, a young actress, had a secret affair with a powerful senator. A courtier whispers about a time when she used a secret potion to bewitch Justinian and make him fall in love with her. A commoner whispers about a time when she would walk the streets at night disguised to listen to the gossip of the people. These stories, whether true or not, served to solidify her reputation as a ruthless and cunning ruler who was capable of anything. This was a new kind of power, a power that was based not on tradition or lineage, but on reputation. Theodora understood this with a terrifying clarity. She knew that in order to rule, she had to be more than just a person. She had to be a legend. She had to be a figure of fear and awe, a person who was so powerful that her name alone could inspire terror. She had to be a serpent, a creature of the shadows, a woman who could strike from the darkness and destroy her enemies without a sound. Her enemies tried to use her past against her, but they failed. They tried to shame her, but they only made her stronger. They tried to paint her as a monster, but in doing so, they only made her more powerful. Theodora, the Serpent Empress, was a living, breathing testament to the idea that you could turn your greatest weakness into your greatest strength. She had been shamed for her past, and now she was using that past to rule an entire empire. The whispers of a serpent were not just a political tool. They were a form of psychological warfare. Theodora's enemies were not just fighting her. They were fighting a ghost, a legend, a woman who was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. They were fighting a woman who had a network of spies in every corner of the city, a woman who knew their secrets before they even knew them themselves. They were fighting a woman who had a kind of power that they could not comprehend, a power that was born of a mix of fear and admiration. Theodora, the Empress, was a living, breathing symbol of the power of a woman who had been underestimated for her entire life. She was a testament to the idea that you could rise from the lowest of social stations and become a force of nature. She was a legend, and her legend was not one of gentle kindness or saintly devotion. It was one of ruthless pragmatism, of terrifying power, and of a will of iron. And you, as a silent witness, can feel the power that she wielded, a power that was born of the whispers of a serpent. The palace no longer feels like a place of hushed ceremony. It feels like a court of death. You're a silent, unseen presence, a ghost drifting through the shadows, and you can feel the cold, unfeeling hand of Theodora's justice. This isn't justice in the sense of a blind, impartial scale. This is justice as a tool of power, a weapon used to eliminate enemies, to settle scores, and to inspire a terror that would ensure absolute obedience. Theodora, the Empress, is now revealed in her most brutal form, the executioner. She doesn't just command, she destroys, and she does so with a chilling and calculated precision that leaves no room for mercy or dissent. A mainstream historical fact is that Theodora and Justinian's reign was marked by a series of purges and political executions. While Justinian was often the public face of these acts, it was widely believed that Theodora was the driving force behind them. Procopius, her most venomous critic, paints a vivid and horrifying picture of her ruthlessness. He recounts tales of men and women being arrested on trumped-up charges, tortured into giving false confessions, and then quietly executed in secret. These acts were not just about removing rivals. They were about sending a message to the entire empire that no one, no matter how powerful, was safe from the Empress's wrath. She had created a world where a wrong look, a whispered word, or a perceived slight could lead to a swift and brutal end. Here's a quirky tidbit that reveals the bizarre, almost theatrical nature of her purges. It was rumoured that Theodora had a peculiar obsession with a kind of poetic justice. She would often order her enemies to be executed in a manner that mirrored their supposed crimes. A man who was accused of being too ambitious was found to have accidentally fallen from a high tower. A woman who was rumoured to be sleeping with a rival was found to have been secretly poisoned. These acts were not just a way to kill her enemies, they were a way to humiliate them, to turn their deaths into a public spectacle that would serve as a warning to others. She was, in a way, a master of dark performance art, and her stage was the entire city of Constantinople. Historians still argue whether Theodora was a paranoid tyrant or a pragmatic ruler who was simply doing what was necessary to survive. Was her ruthlessness a sign of a deeply malevolent character, or was it a product of a world where power was a zero-sum game and where she had to be more brutal than her rivals to maintain her position? The debate reveals the complex and contradictory nature of her character. She was a woman who was capable of both profound cruelty and profound compassion, a pragmatist who was also a true believer in her own divine right to rule. Her acts of violence were not just about eliminating threats, they were about solidifying her power and ensuring that her legacy would be one of absolute unyielding control. You can almost feel the fear in the air as you float through the palace. A high-ranking general, a man who had led armies and conquered empires, is now a prisoner in his own home. He had dared to question Theodora's authority, and he was now paying the price. She had sent her eunuchs to his house, and they had arrested him on trumped-up charges of treason. He was tried in a secret court, and he was found guilty. He was not publicly executed, instead he was quietly poisoned in his own bed. His death ruled a suicide. The message was clear. She did not need to make a show of her power. Her power was a silent, invisible force that could reach anyone, anywhere. This was a new kind of power, a power that was based not on traditional lineage but on fear. Theodora understood this with a terrifying clarity. She knew that in order to rule, she had to be more than just an empress. She had to be a figure of terror. She had to be a legend, a myth, a woman who was so powerful that her name alone could inspire a shiver of fear in the hearts of her enemies. She was a master of the game, a woman who understood that the true source of power was not in physical strength or military might, but in the knowledge that she could, and would, destroy anyone who stood in her way. Her acts of violence were not just about eliminating threats. They were about remaking the world in her own image. She was tearing down the old social order, the one that had excluded her and her kind, and she was building a new one in its place. She was showing the world that lineage and tradition meant nothing, and that power, true power, was in the hands of those who were willing to do whatever was necessary to get it. She was a living, breathing testament to the idea that you could rise from the ashes of your past and become a force of nature. Theodora's journey from the brothel to the throne was a testament to her ability to turn her own pain into a weapon. She had been used and abused, and now she was in a position to inflict that same pain on others. She had seen the worst of humanity, and she was now giving it back to them tenfold. She was a woman who had been forced to be tough, and now she was using that toughness to dominate an entire empire. Her acts of violence were not just an act of cruelty, they were an act of survival, a testament to her unyielding will and her indomitable spirit. She had a kind of psychological dominance over her subjects that was born of her own past, a past where she had to fight for every scrap of respect and every bit of power. And now she was in a position to demand that respect, and she would not hesitate to destroy anyone who dared to question her authority. She was the Empress, and she was the executioner. The air in Constantinople, already heavy with the weight of intrigue and fear, now grows thick with the smell of sickness and death. You're a silent, invisible witness, and you find yourself in the heart of the greatest plague the ancient world had ever known. This isn't just a pestilence, it's a social and political upheaval, and Theodora, the Empress, is more than just a survivor. She's a beneficiary, a ruthless pragmatist who sees in this catastrophe not a sign of divine wrath, but a tool she can use to consolidate her power. Theodora, the prostitute queen, had already conquered the world. Now she was going to use a disease to purify it. A mainstream historical fact is that the Justinian plague, which struck the Byzantine Empire in 541 to 542 AD, was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. It killed millions of people, crippled the economy, and plunged the empire into a state of panic and despair. Theodora, however, did not flee the city. While many of the city's elite, including Justinian himself, were struck down by the disease, Theodora remained in Constantinople, overseeing the relief efforts and using the crisis as an opportunity to secure her rule. She was a pragmatist who understood that a crisis was a chance to prove her mettle, to show the people that she was a leader who would not abandon them in their time of need. She was, in a way, a master of crisis management, and she used her past experiences to navigate the chaos with a terrifying efficiency. Here's a quirky tidbit that adds a layer of bizarre, almost spiritual significance to the plague. It was believed by many that the plague was a sign of divine displeasure with the empire, a punishment for its sins. Theodora, however, seemed to see it differently. She used the plague as an excuse to purge the city of her enemies. She would have them arrested on the pretext of spreading the disease, of being agents of a foreign power, or of simply being undesirables. The plague, you realise, was a perfect cover for her political purges. It was a way for her to get rid of her rivals without having to resort to public executions, which would have made her look cruel. She was, in a way, a master of a kind of political magic, using a natural disaster as a cover for her own dark deeds. Historians still argue whether Theodora's actions during the plague were a testament to her compassion and her commitment to her people, or a cold, calculated move to seize more power. Was she a humanitarian who risked her own life to save others, or was she a ruthless opportunist who used a crisis to her advantage? The debate reveals the complex and contradictory nature of her character. She was a woman who was capable of both profound compassion and profound cruelty, a pragmatist who was also a true believer in her own divine right to rule. Her actions during the plague were a perfect blend of both, a public show of empathy that had a very real political purpose. You can almost feel the fear in the air as you float through the city. The streets are empty, the shops are closed, and the only sound is the constant ringing of church bells and the mournful cries of the bereaved. But in the midst of this chaos, there is a sense of order. Theodora is everywhere. She is a ghost, a presence that looms over the city. She's organising the burial details, overseeing the distribution of food, and ensuring that the sick are cared for. She's a woman who is in her element, a woman who is unafraid of death and decay. She had seen the worst of humanity, and she was now in a position to rule over it, to bring order to the chaos, and to make herself indispensable to her people. This was a new kind of power, a power that was based not on tradition or lineage, but on a kind of unyielding will. Theodora understood this with a terrifying clarity. She knew that in order to rule, she had to be more than just an empress. She had to be a figure of strength and resilience. She had to be a legend, a myth, a woman who could not be defeated by a disease, a woman who could stare death in the face and not flinch. She was a master of the game, a woman who understood that the true source of power was not in physical strength or military might, but in the knowledge that she could and would overcome any obstacle. The plague was a perfect storm of opportunity for Theodora. It was a way for her to show the world that she was more than just a courtesan who had stumbled into power. She was a leader, a survivor, a woman who was capable of anything. She used the plague to her advantage, to solidify her power and to ensure that her legacy would be one of absolute, unyielding control. She was a living, breathing testament to the idea that you could rise from the ashes of your past and become a force of nature. Theodora's journey from the brothel to the throne was a testament to her ability to turn her own pain into a weapon. She had been used and abused, and now she was in a position to inflict that same pain on others. She had seen the worst of humanity, and she was now giving it back to them, tenfold. She was a woman who had been forced to be tough, and now she was using that toughness to dominate an entire empire. Her actions during the plague were not just an act of cruelty, they were an act of survival, a testament to her unyielding will and her indomitable spirit. She had a kind of psychological dominance over her subjects that was born of her own past, a past where she had to fight for every scrap of respect and every bit of power. And now she was in a position to demand that respect, and she would not hesitate to destroy anyone who dared to question her authority. She was the Empress, and she was the Queen of the Plague. The plague has passed, leaving in its wake a city of ghosts and a political landscape forever altered. You're a silent, invisible presence, a witness to the psychological aftermath of Theodora's reign. The air is no longer thick with the scent of death, but it is heavy with something far more insidious: fear. This isn't the fleeting fear of a mob or an invading army. It is a deep-seated systemic terror that has seeped into the very foundations of the Byzantine court. Theodora, the Empress, has left an indelible mark on the minds of her subjects, a legacy of unyielding power and ruthless pragmatism that will echo through the centuries. A mainstream historical fact is that Theodora's reign, for all its accomplishments in law and architecture, was a time of immense political insecurity for the Roman elite. The old families who had once held power through lineage and tradition were now forced to reckon with an empress who did not play by their rules. She had shown them that their status, their wealth, and their very lives were dependent on her whims. The psychological impact of this was profound. The old elite were no longer secure in their positions. They were now in a constant state of fear, a fear that their pasts, their secrets, and their very existence could be wiped out with a single command from the Empress. She had created a new kind of power dynamic, one that was based not on respect or tradition, but on a kind of absolute, unyielding fear. Here's a quirky tidbit that reveals the bizarre, almost theatrical nature of this fear. It was said that the mere sight of Theodora's personal guards, a group of imposing men known as the Silentiari, was enough to make a powerful man tremble. These men, who were loyal to Theodora alone, were not just bodyguards. They were a symbol of her power, a constant reminder that she was watching and that she was a force to be reckoned with. Their silence was a kind of a psychological weapon, a way for Theodora to show her subjects that her power was not just in what she said, but in what she chose not to say. Their very presence was a kind of unspoken threat, a silent promise of her ruthlessness. Historians still argue whether Theodora's legacy was one of a tyrant or a visionary. Was she simply a woman who used her power to oppress her people, or was she a brilliant leader who was simply misunderstood? The debate highlights the complex and often contradictory nature of her character. She was a woman who was capable of both profound cruelty and profound compassion, a pragmatist who was also a true believer in her own divine right to rule. Her legacy of fear was a product of her own life, a life of being marginalized, of being judged, of being used. She had seen the worst of humanity, and she was now giving it back to them, tenfold. She was a woman who had been forced to be tough, and now she was using that toughness to dominate an entire empire. You can almost feel the fear in the air as you float through the palace. A high-ranking official, a man who once dismissed Theodora as a common harlot, is now grovelling at her feet, begging for his life. He looks at her with a cold, unfeeling gaze, his eyes a window into a world of pain and suffering. He doesn't see a woman. He sees a symbol of all the people who had ever hurt her, and he is more than happy to make an example of him. She orders his arrest, his wealth is confiscated, and his family is scattered to the winds. The message is clear. The past is not forgotten, and the Empress does not forgive. This was a new kind of power, a power that was based not on tradition or lineage, but on fear. Theodora understood this with a terrifying clarity. She knew that in order to rule, she had to be more than just an empress. She had to be a figure of terror. She had to be a legend, a myth, a woman who was so powerful that her name alone could inspire a shiver of fear in the hearts of her enemies. She was a master of the game, a woman who understood that the true source of power was not in physical strength or military might, but in the knowledge that she could and would destroy anyone who stood in her way. Her acts of violence were not just about eliminating threats, they were about remaking the world in her own image. She was tearing down the old social order, the one that had excluded her and her kind, and she was building a new one in its place. She was showing the world that lineage and tradition meant nothing, and that power, true power, was in the hands of those who were willing to do whatever was necessary to get it. She was a living, breathing testament to the idea that you could rise from the ashes of your past and become a force of nature. Theodora's viciousness was a product of her own life, a life of being marginalized, of being judged, of being used. She had seen the worst of humanity, and she was now giving it back to them tenfold. She was a woman who had been forced to be tough, and now she was using that toughness to dominate an entire empire. Her acts of violence were not just an act of cruelty. They were an act of survival, a testament to her unyielding will and her indomitable spirit. She had a kind of psychological dominance over her subjects that was born of her own past, a past where she had to fight for every scrap of respect and every bit of power. And now she was in a position to demand that respect, and she would not hesitate to destroy anyone who dared to question her authority. She was the Empress, and she was the executioner. Theodora's journey from the brothel to the throne was a testament to her ability to turn her own sin into a source of sanctified power. She had used the profane to achieve her goals, and now she was using the sacred to justify them. She was a living, breathing paradox, a woman who embodied the very tension between good and evil. And you, as a silent witness, can feel the power that she wielded, a power that was born of a blend of ruthless pragmatism and a deep, abiding faith. She was a woman who had made a pact with the devil and a pact with God, and she was more than happy to rule in both of their names. The air in the great palace, once filled with the scent of perfume and the soft rustle of silk, now seems to carry the faint, cold scent of iron. You're a silent, unseen presence, a ghost that has witnessed the transformation of a woman from a stage performer to a force of nature. Theodora, the Empress, is no longer a person. She is a concept. She is the living embodiment of ruthless ambition, of a will of iron, and of a power so absolute that it defies all convention. She is the serpent on the throne, a creature that has shed its old skin and emerged as a symbol of terror and awe. Her story, you realize, is not a fairy tale of rags to riches. It is a brutal lesson in the art of power. A mainstream historical fact that solidifies her reputation as a ruthless ruler is her handling of the Nika riots in 532 AD. When the city was in flames and the Emperor Justinian was on the verge of fleeing, it was Theodora who famously stood her ground and convinced him to stay and fight. Her words, "The purple makes a fine shroud," are a testament to her unyielding will and her utter contempt for cowardice. She was the one who ordered the army to march into the hippodrome and slaughter the rioters, a bloody act that saved the empire but also cemented her reputation as a cold-blooded pragmatist. She was not a figure of mercy. She was a figure of absolute power, and she was willing to do whatever was necessary to maintain it. Here's a quirky tidbit that adds to the bizarre, almost folkloric quality of her persona. It was said that Theodora had a kind of a sixth sense, an uncanny ability to know a person's true intentions just by looking into their eyes. She would often receive new courtiers in a private audience, not to make small talk, but to stare into their souls, to see if they were loyal or disloyal. It was a kind of psychological test, a way for her to weed out her enemies before they even had a chance to act. She was, in a way, a master of a kind of human magic, using her past as a performer to read people's emotions and to see the things they tried to hide. Her eyes, it was said, were like a mirror, reflecting a person's true nature back at them. Historians still argue whether Theodora's unyielding ambition was a product of her unique character, or a necessary evil in a world where women had to be twice as ruthless as men to survive. Was she a monster, a woman who took pleasure in the destruction of others, or was she a brilliant leader who was simply misunderstood? The debate highlights the complex and often contradictory nature of her character. She was a woman who was capable of both profound cruelty and profound compassion, a pragmatist who was also a true believer in her own divine right to rule. Her legacy of fear was a product of her own life, a life of being marginalized, of being judged, of being used. She had seen the worst of humanity, and she was now giving it back to them, tenfold. She was a woman who had been forced to be tough, and now she was using that toughness to dominate an entire empire. You can almost feel her presence, the aura of a woman who is in complete control. She moves through the palace with a kind of silent serpentine grace, her every movement calculated, her every word a weapon. She is not a beautiful empress, she is a terrifying one. She has a kind of psychological dominance over her subjects that is born of her own past, a past where she had to fight for every scrap of respect and every bit of power. She has no illusions about the world. She knows that men will use her if they can, so she has decided to use them first. She's a master of the double game, of saying one thing and doing another, of making a man feel important while she is secretly undermining him. She is, in a way, a political genius, and her stage is the imperial court. Her journey from the brothel to the throne was a testament to her ability to turn her own sin into a source of sanctified power. She had used the profane to achieve her goals, and now she was using the sacred to justify them. She was a living, breathing paradox, a woman who embodied the very tension between good and evil. And you, as a silent witness, can feel the power that she wielded, a power that was born of a blend of ruthless pragmatism and a deep abiding faith. She was a woman who had made a pact with the devil and a pact with God, and she was more than happy to rule in both of their names. Theodora's legacy is not just one of terror, it is also one of transformation. She had shown the world that a woman could rise from the lowest of social stations and become a force of nature. She had torn down the old social order, the one that had excluded her and her kind, and she had built a new one in its place. She had proven to the world that lineage and tradition meant nothing, and that power, true power, was in the hands of those who were willing to do whatever was necessary to get it. She was a living, breathing testament to the idea that you could rise from the ashes of your past and become a force of nature. She was the serpent on the throne, a woman who had stared into the heart of darkness and had emerged, not as a victim, but as a queen. The palace feels quieter now, the air no longer thick with the electric current of Theodora's presence. You're a silent witness, a ghost drifting through a world that has been forever changed by a single woman. The whispers are softer now, the fear more ingrained, a part of the very architecture of the court. Theodora, the serpent on the throne, is no longer a living, breathing force. She's a memory, a legend, a shadow that still looms over the empire she helped build. Her body, once the subject of so much debate and scandal, is now a still, lifeless form, lying in state in a quiet chamber. This is the end of her journey, a final, poignant scene that is as dramatic and as unexpected as her life itself. A mainstream historical fact is that Theodora died in 548 AD, at the relatively young age of 48. Her death was not from violence or a coup, but from cancer, a slow and agonizing illness that slowly sapped her of her strength. Her death was a stark contrast to her life, which was marked by a brutal, unyielding will. She was a woman who had fought for everything she had, but in the end she was defeated by a force she could not outsmart, outwit, or outmuscle. Her death was a quiet, almost private affair, a stark contrast to her public life, which was a constant spectacle of power and intrigue. Her passing was a moment of profound change for the empire, which was now left without its most ruthless and pragmatic leader. Here's a quirky tidbit that reveals the bizarre, almost spiritual significance of her death. It was said that Theodora, in her final moments, did not show fear or regret. Instead, she was said to be calm and serene, believing that she had fulfilled her divine destiny. She was a woman who had a deep and abiding belief in her own fate, and in the end she faced death with the same unyielding will that she had faced life. She was a woman who was in control of her own narrative until the very end, and her death was a final theatrical performance designed to show the world that she was not just a person, but a legend. Historians still argue whether Theodora's legacy was one of a tyrant or a visionary. Was her death a sign that her power was finally broken? Or was it a final act of control, a way for her to cement her legacy as a force of nature that could not be defeated, even by death? The debate highlights the complex and contradictory nature of her character. She was a woman who was capable of both profound cruelty and profound compassion, a pragmatist who was also a true believer in her own divine right to rule. Her legacy of fear was a product of her own life, a life of being marginalized, of being judged, of being used. She had seen the worst of humanity, and she was now giving it back to them tenfold. She was a woman who had been forced to be tough, and now she was using that toughness to dominate an entire empire. You can almost feel the silence in the room. Theodora's body is still, her face at peace, a stark contrast to the turbulent life she led. You can see her final moments, the slow, agonizing decline, the final, quiet breath. She is not a symbol of fear anymore. She is a symbol of a life lived to its fullest, of a woman who was unafraid to be herself, even if that meant being a monster. She was a woman who had been shamed for her past, and she had used that past to rule an entire empire. She was a living, breathing testament to the idea that you could rise from the ashes of your past and become a force of nature. She was the serpent on the throne, a woman who had stared into the heart of darkness and had emerged, not as a victim, but as a queen. Her legacy is not just one of terror, it is also one of transformation. She had shown the world that a woman could rise from the lowest of social stations and become a force of nature. She had torn down the old social order, the one that had excluded her and her kind, and she had built a new one in its place. She had proven to the world that lineage and tradition meant nothing, and that power, true power, was in the hands of those who were willing to do whatever was necessary to get it. She was a living, breathing testament to the idea that you could rise from the ashes of your past and become a force of nature. She was the serpent on the throne, a woman who had stared into the heart of darkness and had emerged, not as a victim, but as a queen. Theodora's journey from the brothel to the throne was a testament to her ability to turn her own sin into a source of sanctified power. She had used the profane to achieve her goals, and now she was using the sacred to justify them. She was a living, breathing paradox, a woman who embodied the very tension between good and evil, and you, as a silent witness, can feel the power that she wielded, a power that was born of a blend of ruthless pragmatism and a deep, abiding faith. She was a woman who had made a pact with the devil and a pact with God, and she was more than happy to rule in both of their names. Her legacy is a testament to the idea that power is not something that is given to you. It is something that you have to take, and you have to hold on to it with a will of iron. The final image of Theodora is not of her in her imperial robes, but of her in her final moments. A woman who was at peace with herself and with the world she had conquered. She had done what she had set out to do. She had proved her worth, she had destroyed her enemies, and she had built a new world in her own image. She had shown the world that a woman, no matter her past, could be a ruler, a leader, a force of nature. She was a testament to the idea that in a world of rigid social rules, you could break them all if you were smart enough and ruthless enough. She was the last breath of a dying empire and the first breath of a new one. A woman who had the courage to stare into the heart of darkness and not flinch. The silence of the final act is the one that lingers most. The clamour of the hippodrome, the whispers of the palace, the cries of the plague victims, all of it fades into a single quiet moment. You are left alone with the echoes of a life lived on a scale that is almost unimaginable. Theodora's story isn't one of a moral lesson or a simple hero's journey. It's a study in extremes, a look at what happens when a person with nothing to lose gains everything, and what she's willing to do to keep it. The world she left behind was one of fear, but it was also one of possibility. Her power was a raw, unfiltered force that tore down the old order and built a new one in its place. It's the kind of tale that makes you question everything you thought you knew about power, love, and what it truly means to be a ruler. So as you drift away from the shadows of this ancient city, let the lingering silence wash over you. Let the darkness of the past fade into the calm of the present. Theodora's story has come to an end, and with it, the chaos of her world can finally recede. There's nothing left to fear here now, just a long, quiet night, and the gentle hum of the world, just you and the darkness and the soft, steady rhythm of your own breath.